Alright folks, I've done a video about assembling the West Coast Avengers team, but I'm sure a lot of you are thinking, I want to know more about this very Starship Troopers. Would you like to know more? Well, guess what? I got 15 facts about the West Coast Avengers. The West Coast Avengers were the first Avengers team to break off and sort of franchise themselves out from the original core group. And this is kind of groundbreaking because before then it was always just the Avengers. There were no offshoots, no other branches or brands of them. And nowadays, you know, we have different ideas and concepts with the Avengers. You've got like the Uncanny Avengers, the Avengers Unity Squad, and of course, you know, in the initiative, you had the 50-state Avengers initiative thing going on. But these guys were the original trailblazers and eyebrow raisers, the first franchised Avengers team. As I said during the creation of this little display here, the team was originally a concept of vision. It makes sense, there is a man with vision, and he envisioned a separate branch of the Avengers that could be like the backup if anything happened to the originals, and also the fact that the Avengers at the time didn't have the instantaneous, you know, transport, teleportation type abilities that they often utilize now. So they needed a West Coast team to be there full time. Of course, Vision was like, I'm not leading the B team. Hawkeye, you can do that. A lot of people could argue that the West Coast Avengers was the making of Hawkeye as a character, a very defining sort of time for him, because he went from being that kind of joking, rogue kind of person to someone who had real heart and soul and passion for doing, you know, the right thing and leading the team and being sort of the essential nucleus of this group. It was a cool kind of character evolution. Even though the Avengers West Coast, you could argue, was a B team, he was the A+ player of that B team, and really it was the making of the character. Next up, guys, the West Coast Avengers were the first government-sanctioned super team. I'm not sure it was government-sanctioned, but working alongside the government, which makes a lot of sense because in this world of superheroes and vigilantes and whatnot, there would actually be laws. I always thought it was amazing that the superhero initiative was like this big deal where it was like, you know what? You actually can't put on a costume and go and beat people up without due process and fair trial. It's like, that shouldn't be a revelation. But yes, the West Coast Avengers were working alongside the government, and that led to some benefits for them and some big conflicts as well, and again made for an interesting dynamic, and especially with Hawkeye, who is always, as a character, very much a contrarian. Surprisingly, he was all on board for working alongside the US government. Now, a character who I was debating having in this display was Hank Pym. And of course, he's a character who is a controversial one with his backstory. And that was the reason why he was only a fringe member of the West Coast Avengers. Originally, they did actually invite him to be a full-time member, but it was Hank himself who said, look, you guys, this is a new superhero team. You're working with the government. I have a salty past, so it wouldn't look good necessarily. They were thinking about the optics, which is kind of fun. You know, that they're like, how is this going to play, you know, in Middle America? What are people going to think about this? So Hank Pym worked with the West Coast Avengers, but in more of an advisory scientific role rather than being front and center on the team. So as I mentioned earlier, Jim Rhodes joined the team under two different aliases, first as Iron Man and then as War Machine, because he was working as under a nom de plume. They assumed he was Tony Stark in the armor, and when they found out that he had been deceiving them, they were like, you're fired. But of course, you know, they kissed and made up, and eventually Rhodey came back as War Machine, making him the only character to be under the team in two different names. The Thing, Firebird, Darkhawk, and Machine Man were all honorary West Coast Avengers. The team actually kept themselves relatively small for the best part of their over 100-issue run. It really was like 6 essential characters, but then others would come and go and pitch in, and it was kind of a fun sort of rotating guest star sort of setup that they had. And that's what makes the team quite fun and dynamic. Like the Avengers themselves, you never know who's going to be popping back and forth. But I declined putting Thing in here because it's like he was just like a little guest star. And then Firebird, I've got to admit, I was like, who's Firebird? Now we're going to talk about the negative side of the government interference, and that is the addition of US Agent, currently being played by Captain America here. The government had such a heavy hand in the West Coast Avengers that at one point they decided, you know what, we don't like the way this team is going. You're maybe a little bit too sort of independent with the decisions you're making. So they ousted Hawkeye as the leader and replaced him with US Agent, which is a dubious decision at best, considering that it was common knowledge that US Agent was slightly unstable at the time, and that actually led to a lot of the West Coast Avengers quitting the team. And it was a nice illustration of the family dynamic that the team had. It wasn't just a random assortment of superheroes. They had that very close familial connection. So when US Agent came in and very unceremoniously ousted Hawkeye, a lot of the team were like, yep, I'm done. In a fun little real-world note, the West Coast Avengers had their name changed to Avengers West Coast, and that was simply because Marvel wanted all of their Avengers titles to be displayed together on comic shop shelves. So of course, gosh, harken back to the day of me being in comic shops, they are all displayed alphabetically, therefore they wanted the Avengers together, so West Coast Avengers became Avengers West Coast. Not quite so catchy. One of the reasons why Avengers West Coast had such a strong fan following, I think, and is so fondly remembered, is because it wasn't passed from one writing team and one creative team to another, causing characters to, you know, start stories and then stop or have character changes. There were just 3 creative teams in over 100 issues, and that really made the book feel like a cohesive, ongoing story. So those creative teams were, and I'm gonna cheat here and double check my notes. Steve Englehart was the original writer, and he wrote the first 60 issues, so you got a great basis and a consistency for the start of the stories. Then John Byrne, help me out. Either way, he took over the book for a very short run, but this was during the time when he was really respected as a writer, so people were like, okay, great, we're on board with this. He hadn't yet done Spider-Man Chapter 1. And finally, Roy and Dan Thomas took over from issue 60 until the end, so they really sort of bookended. It was 2 chapters, essentially, with John Byrne's run in the middle, and that just made a wonderfully cohesive story that keeps the characters still fun to this day. Okay, the next fact is me putting my cards on the table here. I thought the West Coast Avengers were the Great Lakes Avengers. I didn't make the distinction in my head, and I got very, very confused, because I was like, wait a minute, the Great Lakes Avengers are a joke team. They've got like Flatman and Squirrel Girl and Big Bertha. Why is Hawkeye on there? Why is Vision? Why? That doesn't make sense. And then the penny dropped and I was like, oh no, wait, they're 2 different teams, you dumbass. So yes, the West Coast Avengers launched, well, sort of, you know, were an inspiration for another spin-off team, the Great Lakes Avengers, which were always, you know, they were written as a parody, jokey team. But because the writing was fun and the characters were bizarre and interesting and kind of lovable, the Great Lakes Avengers amassed a big fan following. Not for this guy, though. Clueless, obviously. Avengers, united they stand. Can you imagine the writing team pitch meeting, you know, ideas where they must have sat around and gone, all right, we've got the Marvel characters. We can do an Avengers cartoon show. We can bring ourselves up into the mainstream. Which characters shall we use? Oh, I don't know, Thor, Iron Man, Captain America? Nah, let's have Hawkeye and a weird Ant-Man and Tiger and just like, let's use all the second string characters and none of our actual A-list franchise players. And no one went, why? And instead we got Avengers United They Stand, the bizarre 1999 Avengers cartoon that came out, which looked nothing like any of the Avengers we're used to seeing. Oh, the point of that little fact and tirade was that the team closely resembled Avengers West Coast, and it was just bizarre. Like, why are you doing West Coast Avengers when you have the Avengers? The Ultimate Universe, of course, had their own version of the West Coast Avengers, which were like a paramilitary secret wetworks team run by Nick Fury, which I always thought was kind of odd because that's sort of what the Ultimate Avengers were anyway, or the Ultimates were. But the idea was that this was like so covert, they couldn't do anything public. And it was a typical sort of gritty Ultimate sort of version of the team, which I didn't have much time for. Ultimately, no pun intended, they went rogue and were defeated by the Ultimates, and that was the end of the Ultimate West Coast Avengers. Now going back to one of my favourite storylines during the Initiative and Avengers Academy, Hawkeye was one of the head trainers of the Young Avengers, the Avengers Academy. But there came a time where they were without a base of operations, they had to re-establish themselves, and Hawkeye, brainchild, he was like, we have the West Coast Avengers facility, like, right over there. So Hawkeye sort of unofficially restarted the West Coast Avengers with Avengers Academy. The mid-90s were a time of big change in Marvel, where basically things were going bad and they had to throw everything at the wall to see what would stick. And by that point, or actually a couple of years previously, Avengers West Coast had come to the end of its run. They were like, okay, we're done, it's not kind of cool anymore, we gotta end this. And in 1994, wow, nothing fell over there. In 1994, they started Forceworks, which was like the most 90s team imaginable, but it was essentially, you know, coming from the ashes of West Coast Avengers. You had a lot of familiar characters there. You had Spider-Woman, you had US Agent, so it was almost like a sequel, I tell you what it was a grim and gritty reboot of Avengers West Coast, and it lasted for about as long as you would expect. So folks, those were 15 facts about the West Coast Avengers. Did you enjoy it? Comment below, let me know. If you like what you've seen and you want to see some more fact videos, then also let me know, because I want to branch out. I want to appeal to what people want to see, because either way, I get to sit here and play with toys and talk about comics, so I'm happy as a clam. In the meantime, folks, enjoy the Data Blast coming up. Some of the best things that I found on Instagram. Check out the creators and go give them a follow, because they're doing amazing work. And until next time, keep displaying model behavior.